Hello, I'm Mike Coe, and together with my partner Lizzie, I used to live in the highly energy efficient autonomous house in Worcestershire. But now we're right at the very beginning of a second self-build project, one which came as almost as big a surprise as the first one. This series of video reports, together with Facebook and Twitter feeds, and a dedicated website with an almost live webcam, will mean you can keep up to date with the project, from the start right through to what will hopefully be a successful conclusion. But the idea of this first report is to answer the most frequently asked question, which is, why did you leave behind your fantastic house in Worcestershire, which you put so much time and effort into building, and move so far away?
For Q12, good evening.
To answer that, I need to take you back 11 years to the time I retired from my career in television news, which I did at the age of 49, after 25 years in the business, first of all as a sound recordist, and later as a cameraman and editor. I was ready for a change and not particularly worried if I never picked up a TV camera again. The idea of doing a self-build came to me in a flash one morning. Unlike many self-builders, I didn't really have any ambition to do this before. But Lizzie and I had a long-term plan to sell up and leave London. I sort of liked the idea of the challenge, although having worked on houses throughout my life, I had no illusions that a self-build would be easy. Most importantly, my concerns about what we, the human race, were doing to the environment here on planet Earth were becoming more and more acute. To build a highly efficient, ultra-low energy house seemed to be a brilliant way of addressing all three of these issues, and maybe, just maybe, doing a little bit for the environment. And that's how the Autonomous House project in the village of Cropthorne in Worcestershire came about. We started on site in June 2009, and tile by tile, brick by brick, the house took shape.
I'm building it brick by brick, brick by brick.
And it wasn't easy. It was 3 years of very hard work, much of it hands-on, much of it dirty and unpleasant.
I'm building a house where I can think and have some balance and dignity.
But as we drew nearer to completion, we realised that we had a house to be proud of. It had been designed to be so efficient that it didn't need any heating. A rainwater harvesting system, which I designed and built in the basement, supplied all of the domestic water, which was stored in recycled orange juice containers and purified by a slow sand filter. A dry composting toilet system, with straight-through pedestals and a compost chamber below, turned human waste into incredibly useful garden fertiliser. You can put it on the garden compost. It was a really great house to live in, and the many parties of visitors we showed round were obviously impressed. It even picked up a few awards and quite a lot of press coverage along the way. But I began to feel disillusioned quite early on in the project, long before the house was complete. At first, I had a feeling that we might be experiencing a change of direction, that there might be a new approach to environmental matters on the horizon. The Code for Sustainable Homes had just been introduced in the UK, and it was a positive development, with progressive tightening of building standards to be introduced in the following years. The autonomous house was way ahead of the first Code for Sustainable Homes standard, but I hoped that we might be at the vanguard of a new ecological building movement, that what we were building wouldn't just be a fantastic home, but also an example of what we should be doing that might lead the way and possibly even be a little bit influential.
Wall Street's worst day since 9/11. The Dow plunging more than 500 points. The S&P down almost 5%. The wreckage unprecedented.
At the same time as we were building, the 2008 economic crisis was really taking hold. It began in the subprime mortgage market in the United States. Then came the collapse of Lehman Brothers, and the ensuing crisis spread around the world. In Britain, Northern Rock collapsed, and queues formed outside branches as people tried to retrieve their savings.
And we're taking our minutes to the bank.
After a few rather nerve-wracking days, the Chancellor, Alistair Darling, announced that the government and the Bank of England would guarantee all deposits held at Northern Rock. Although the 2008 financial crisis was terrible news for huge numbers of people, I had a faint hope that something good might come out of it. It's increasingly obvious that to pursue perpetual growth, which we've been doing for decades, is totally unsustainable. And as we began our build, the economy had slowed significantly, meaning less economic activity, and so less damage was being done. Could we, I wondered, use this to transition to a steady-state model, such as Herman Daly's ecological economics, which could work for everybody, produce a fairer society, and reduce consumption and waste to a point where we lived in balance with the global ecosystem, never demanding more of it than it was able to cope with? Not a bit of it. As soon as the recession began to bite, the neoclassical economists and mainstream politicians began a mad scramble to restart growth. It's not surprising. They couldn't think what else to do. They sold their souls to growth years ago. The global financial crisis, fundamentally caused by the effects of too much growth, was to be cured by more of the same. More growth. Total madness.
Don't be a fool.
So, as we resorted to quantitative easing and various other acts of desperation to try to revitalise a dying economy, we had another problem, a shortage of housing. Setting aside the politics behind what has been described as a crisis, I would just mention that as with economic growth, it isn't possible to have never-ending population growth on a finite planet. How many goldfish can you fit in a bowl? On balance, though, we probably do need some more housing. In Britain, we're in an unfortunate but not unusual position that the overwhelming majority of house building is done very badly by a small number of extremely large companies. These high-volume house builders are capable of churning out their estates of noddy boxes, as Grand Design's Kevin MacLeod calls them, by the thousand. They've been responsible for the blandification of our towns and villages, the edges of which now all look exactly the same. They build only to make money. Profit is their sole reason for existing. They build as cheaply as they can, and as a result, they build rubbish.
Your ugly houses look so. Your ugly houses look so.
The high-volume house builders don't like brownfield developments, as it costs too much to demolish and clear sites, and they don't like restoring existing properties either. That's far too expensive. And so their revolting estates sprawl out into the countryside, leading to more private car journeys, further increasing our impact on the environment, decreasing the amount of natural habitat, and so decreasing biodiversity. The campaign to protect rural England have demonstrated how we could provide almost all of the new housing we need with virtually no greenfield developments at all. But are they consulted or even listened to? Well, they don't seem to be, do they? Of course, there are notable exceptions to the building rules. Architects, developers, local authorities and private individuals really working hard and pushing the envelope on quality and energy efficiency. But sadly, in the UK, they're a minority, and the volume house builders dominate. And they are immensely powerful. So powerful, in fact, that they do whatever they want, especially when they have friends in government who see house building, no matter how crap it is, as a vote winner. One politician especially complicit in helping out his mates in the big building industry was former Chancellor George Osborne. Sorry, wrong picture. Gideon, to give him his real name, basically gave all the major house builders whatever they wanted. Is the code for sustainable homes too tough for you? Yes, Uncle Gideon, we can't make enough money if we build zero carbon. No problem, we'll scrap it. Is the planning system stopping you building on open countryside for maximum profit? Easy, we'll trash the planning laws. And if anyone objects locally, we'll override them for you at central government level. That's how democracy works. At a time when we're facing an unprecedented environmental crisis, which requires urgent action in all areas of human activity, allowing big property developers to do what the hell they like is not the way to address the housing shortage. It's an absolute disgrace. As far as I'm concerned, the greedy owners and executives of the big property companies and the politicians complicit in allowing them to get away with what they do are all complete and utter I realised that my one ultra-energy efficient house was totally insignificant in the face of the unstoppable march of thousands of underperforming noddy boxes built on the cheap. I'd put my all into something which should have set the standards for others to follow, but in that respect it was a waste of time. I'd also had more than enough of the physical building process and swore I'd never do it again. However, the autonomous house still had value in terms of personal achievement, and it was a really lovely house to live in. Although I was disillusioned, I still wanted to do something to try to make a difference. I was still very much focused on climate change and on the fact that any meaningful action would have to be at all levels, from grassroots right up to global politics. Publicity, increasing awareness of our plight, seemed to be the thing I should concentrate on. I did my first U-turn and decided to pick up a video camera once again. I bought a professional camera kit, amazingly affordable now compared to when I first joined the industry, and I contacted climate activists offering my services. As a result, I was back on the road again, shooting and editing. A new adventure which took me, with Lizzie assisting, all over the UK and to the COP21 climate conference in Paris.
It might be 1 degree here, but it's much warmer here. That's why the ice is melting.
I found that when I was working on something I was fully committed to, with relatively little time pressure, I rather enjoyed it. Now, I can't possibly cover the current state of climate change in full here. It's the wrong place and there isn't time. But I do want to try to give an overview of what I learned, because this, fundamentally, is what led to the decision to pack up, leave the autonomous house behind, and head north. Now, every organism, every species has some kind of effect on its surroundings. It's when one of them gets out of hand that you've got problems. In the beginning, well, around 20,000 BC, it was pretty chilly. But moving forward from there, we can see a steady increase in global temperature, the dotted line on the left. At around 11,000 BC, the trend reversed and the temperature began to drop. There are a number of possible reasons. Some are on this chart. One not mentioned is that around this time, man invented agriculture, planting crops which altered the reflectivity, or albedo, of the Earth's surface, sending more solar energy back out into space. Moving on again, this brief period of cooling ended and the Earth entered a period where the temperature was relatively stable for millennia. We then entered the so-called Little Ice Age, caused by a reduction in solar activity. But then, all of a sudden, around 200 years ago, things changed dramatically and the temperature began to rise at a rate not seen in the previous 22,000 years. In a period representing just 0.9% of this entire timeline, there was an unprecedented increase in global temperatures. These words here are extremely significant. Turn this graphic round and you'll see the shape of Michael Mann's famous hockey stick curve. Now let's look at this graphic, remarkably similar to the previous one, but this time showing atmospheric carbon dioxide on the vertical axis with the same horizontal axis. The upward tilt in the curve, running in parallel with the Industrial Revolution, is almost identical. The increase in CO2 has caused the increase in temperature. Change the horizontal scale to cover the 20,000-year time period we began with, and it's clear that what's happening now is far from typical. You have to be pretty blinkered or in denial to ignore the effects of this warming. In recent years, here in the UK, we've had serious flooding in the West Midlands, Somerset and Yorkshire. Globally, extreme weather events such as Hurricane Haiyan in the Philippines and floods in India, Bangladesh and Nepal have left thousands dead and caused untold suffering. The United States has seen Hurricanes Katrina and Sandy, and just recently Harvey, which has broken multiple records with disastrous consequences, both human and financial. The severity of all of these storms has been amplified by the effects of climate change. Katrina and Sandy were said to be 1 in 100-year events, a storm as serious as Harvey 1 in 800 years. All three have taken place within the space of 12 years. Unless we address the root causes, there will be more and worse to come. Storms such as these are obvious signs that something is going wrong. But it's the less obvious, more insidious things taking place beyond our immediate horizons which are an even greater worry. We hear about the melting of the Arctic sea ice, but what does it mean? Well, one thing it means is that sea levels are rising. The crucial question is by how much? The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, is the body many governments look to for guidance on climate issues. Yet because of the way it operates, the IPCC's predictions are always out of date and extremely conservative. In its last full report in 2013, it predicted a very modest rise in sea levels, 82 centimetres by the year 2100.
L'accord de Paris pour le climat est accepté.
In 2015, the Paris Accord reached a broad agreement on ideally limiting global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. And since then, more realistic estimates have begun to emerge on sea level rise.
The Paris Accord are great, right? They came back with 1.5 degrees instead of 2 degrees. That's the right move. Except, as scientists, we all know we're going to go beyond the 1.5 degree. We're probably already there. And it's going to be difficult to limit ourselves below 2 degrees. And we know from the Paris record that's not going to protect us from sea level. We are committing ourselves to a 6 to 9 meter sea level rise if we stay in that climate.
That would mean loss of all coastal cities, most of the world's large cities, and all their history.
However, sea level rise is only one of multiple interlinked effects of climate change already affecting us today. We've seen 16 of the hottest years on record since the year 2000, with 2016 being the hottest recorded so far. 2017 may well break that record. We're already seeing disintegrating ecosystems, record-breaking wildfires and heat waves which put human life at risk. Violent storms and flooding are putting infrastructure at risk. Droughts and soil erosion are putting food supplies at risk. Long-dormant bacteria and viruses trapped in ice and permafrost for centuries are reviving as the climate warms. Carbon dioxide, the main gas responsible for climate change, is soluble in water, leading to acidification of the oceans, which is having a devastating effect on marine life, an essential part of the delicately balanced global ecosystem. The Great Barrier Reef is said to now be at a terminal stage. The solubility of CO2 in water had a direct effect on us at the autonomous house, where I had to add a pH corrector to the rainwater harvesting system. It now rains dilute carbonic acid, which started to dissolve the copper pipes and threaten the plumbing. This is the sort of thing you might not find out about if you only use mains water. Climate change, combined with mankind's other activities, has triggered the sixth mass extinction, with species being lost at over 1,000 times the normal background rate. Scientists have described this as a biological annihilation. This could place our own future in peril, as over time plant and animal species which we rely on may well be wiped out. One really striking thing I noticed when I was reading up on the current mess we're in is how quickly everything is unravelling. Progressions which were originally linear are accelerating rapidly and becoming exponential, and one of the main reasons for this is positive feedbacks. These are a game changer. They feed on themselves and they feed on each other, accelerating the effects of warming until they reach tipping points, points beyond which, in practical terms, there's no going back. Just one example is solar energy. When the sun shines on a vast expanse of bright white ice, over 90% of the energy is reflected back out into space. As soon as the ice begins to break up, it exposes the dark ocean surface, which absorbs significant amounts of energy, increasing the rate of warming, leading to further ice loss. Disruption of the weather caused by global warming increases the amount of water vapour in the atmosphere, which itself acts as a greenhouse gas, causing further warming. The higher temperatures and semi-drought conditions in some areas turn forests into tinderboxes. As we've seen in the news only recently, fires break out, destroying trees which previously converted carbon dioxide into oxygen. The soot released into the atmosphere can float as far as the poles, where it drops out onto the ice, darkening the surface and increasing the rate of heat absorption, so the ice melts faster. Changing conditions which encourage growth of algae on the ice worsen the so-called dark snow problem. These are just a few of a multitude of positive feedbacks which scientists have identified so far. Any of them could be at or beyond the point of no return. Just a couple of ice cubes can chill an entire glass of water. And the reason is that it takes a lot of energy to convert a solid into a liquid. In the case of water, it's a factor of 80 compared to increasing the temperature of already liquid water by 1 degree. This effect is known as the latent heat of fusion. It means that most of the energy being absorbed in the formerly ice-covered Arctic and Antarctic is currently going into melting the remaining ice, which is temporarily holding the temperature down. Once all of the ice has gone, then sea temperatures will just race away, and all the other effects of global warming will follow rapidly. But there's another gas playing a significant role in climate change. Methane, frozen in permafrost for centuries, is beginning to escape in alarming quantities. Although it decays quickly, its warming potential is 80 times that of CO2. It's exacerbating the greenhouse effect already, but researchers are particularly worried about a possible multi-gigaton methane release from the melting subsea permafrost off the coast of Siberia, which would cause global temperatures to soar within as little as a decade.
We're seeing the permafrost melting, and we're seeing the methane already being released. So it's not a low probability, high catastrophe risk. It's a high catastrophe, high probability risk. We should be making one of our highest scientific priorities, studying and trying to do something about the possibility of a methane outbreak from the Arctic. And unfortunately we're not, because that's scarcely mentioned by IPCC in its assessment, because I think it's being criminally kind of complacent in not wanting to stress or even talk about the possibility of some major catastrophes.
So where are we now? And where are we heading in the current Great Warming event? At the moment, the general consensus among scientists is that we could still, technically, pull ourselves back from the brink of catastrophic climate change. But in order to stand any chance of success, we'd have to actively manipulate the climate, a technique known as geoengineering. The idea of geoengineering has been around for a very long time. One possible strategy would be to reduce the amount of solar energy reaching the Earth by reflecting some of it back into space, a technique known as solar radiation management. There are various ideas, including giant mirrors floating in space, brightening clouds to make them more reflective, and dropping particles in the upper atmosphere, possibly by adding chemicals such as sulfur to aircraft fuel. In other words, addressing the problems caused by pollution with more pollution. But the only really effective option, alongside unprecedented cuts in our emissions, appears to be direct removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, storing it somewhere else, perhaps deep underground. At least this would address the root of the problem. The difficulty is, this technology is still very much in its infancy, with just this one experimental plant now operational in Switzerland. We are a very, very long way away from being able to remove enough CO2 to undo the results of 200 years' worth of dumping waste into the atmosphere. We may well never get there, at least not in time.
I don't know when that time point is. I don't think
the IPCC uses representative concentration pathways, or RCPs, to try to predict what concentrations of greenhouse gases will take us to what future temperatures.
It's worth going through this a little bit because there's a question of why are we doing this? Why are we doing this research? This is why. This is the latest projections. And the alarming thing is that these two scenarios explicitly include negative emissions technologies. So there is geoengineering of the flavour of carbon dioxide removal in the best case scenarios. The very, very alarming thing for us is that we are on this path here. That's AR 8.5. We are slap bang on this trajectory, and that puts us in a very, very different place in our children's or our grandchildren's lifetimes.
Virtually every single emission scenario that we've so far generated includes geoengineering. it assumes it automatically works. Now that's fine if one or two of the scenarios had that, but almost every single scenario has it. So already what we're finding is that geoengineering, even though it's still in a very experimental conceptual stage, that we are assuming it will work and we are embedding it in our scenarios, and from those are what we go on to advise policymakers from.
The emissions pathway in this projection, which we're following, the only one which doesn't include geoengineering, is extremely dangerous. RCPs from 4.5 to 8.5 will lead to total loss of the polar ice sheets and of so many trees that atmospheric greenhouse gases will increase to the point that mankind simply won't be able to survive, one reason being we won't be able to grow the food we need. We've already reached 1 degree of warming above pre-industrial levels, and CO2 concentrations are still rising. Inertia in the system of 2 to 3 decades means we've yet to experience the effects of recent emissions, which have been higher than at any time in the past. The chances of staying on one of the safer pathways are extremely slim.
I think we all hope that emission reductions will be achieved, but the lack of success of current attempt at international agreements encourages pessimism. And I honestly would bet, sad though it is, that the annual CO2 emissions are going to rise year by year for at least the next 20 years.
Even if we manage to develop a carbon capture and storage system capable of removing billions of tons of CO2 from the atmosphere, we'd still need to reduce our own emissions dramatically. We could only do this with unprecedented changes to our lifestyles. We're already way beyond the point where we could install low-energy lighting, drive electric cars, insulate our houses, and then carry on as we've always done. Anybody who suggests otherwise is probably an oil company executive, a politician, or a traditional economist.
The issue of economic growth and whether we can actually have the ongoing improvement in our economy as we currently measure it at the same time of responding to the challenge of climate change is a really thorny issue, and actually a lot of people will shy away from it. What I have done and what colleagues and I have done is try to say if we look just simply at the maths of the climate science and then we look at what the economists tell us you can achieve with a growing economy, we can show very clearly you cannot put those two together. Now that is an unpopular message, but as scientists are concerned, it's not about being liked, it's whether people disagree with our message. And actually no one has come forward that I'm aware of who said that actually the analysis that we're doing is wrong.
So we cannot continue with economic growth and avoid catastrophic warming. The sort of changes we need would include dramatic reductions in air travel, including a programme of airport closures. We're currently still arguing about a third runway at Heathrow. There would need to be a lot less personal travel, significantly reduced consumption, longer-lasting consumer products, eliminating the fad purchasing of, for example, mobile phones and fashion items. We would need more local sourcing of goods and food, with a huge shift away from meat eating to reduce the significant warming effects of methane produced globally by windy livestock. In the longer term, we must reduce the size of the human population, because if we don't do it, the effects of climate change will. These changes are so sweeping that no politician, even if they understood the issues, would dare put them forward. They would undoubtedly be voted out at the earliest opportunity and ostracised by their chums in big business. This is why, aside from ramping up the rhetoric in recent years, politicians have effectively done nothing for decades. Something James Hansen spoke about in Paris in one of Stuart Scott's ClimateMatters.tv presentations.
All the ministers are coming here, or the heads of state, and they're planning to clap each other on the back and say, oh, we're really doing great. This is a very successful conference. We're going to address the climate problem. Well, if that's what happens, then we're screwing the next generation and the following ones.
So our politics, hand in hand with traditional economics and an almost religious devotion to perpetual growth, make it virtually impossible for us to avoid catastrophic climate change. This is why I feel that when scientists say it's technically possible, it'll never actually happen, because fundamentally we aren't capable of the necessary level of global cooperation. If we were, we might have avoided being in this mess in the first place. The most realistic prediction of our likely future which I've heard comes from atmospheric scientist Dr. Ira Leifer, who says, "Some scientists are indicating we should make plans to adapt to a 4-degree hotter world. While prudent, one wonders what portion of the population could adapt to such a world. My view is that it's just a few thousand people seeking refuge in the Arctic or Antarctica." It took a while for the implications of my newfound knowledge to sink in. I realised that, as with the autonomous house, nothing I do as an individual will make any difference. My interactions with some of the world's most eminent climate scientists reinforced my view. The only hope, I think, would be for a global protest movement so powerful and so united that world leaders would be forced to take notice and act. By the time the situation is bad enough for this to happen, so many positive feedbacks will be running, the world will be an unstoppable thermal runaway. All of the temperature graphs are already almost vertical. We have a very real and very serious crisis on our hands. This isn't an easy message to deliver, but I tend to feel that anybody looking at the work of scientists in as much detail as I have, and crucially with an open mind, would surely come to the same conclusions. And yet governments are still ignoring or underestimating the risks. There's a smokescreen of normality when things are anything but normal. And what we're talking about is the future of the planet and the delicately balanced ecosystems which have allowed us to thrive here. It's the future for all of us. It's the future for the children. It's the future for life on Earth. It's ironic that people are watching the amazing wildlife documentaries made by David Attenborough and loving and adoring the planet when we're about to destroy it. It's a huge responsibility we have. We humans are just one species on this planet, but we've done so much damage. I don't know, any more than anybody else does, exactly where we're heading. But being in late middle age and hoping, all being well, to live for another 20 years, I decided that the south of England is likely to become uncomfortably hot, perhaps dangerously hot, during that time. Based on everything I'd learned, I decided we should move nearer to one of the poles, a proposal Lizzie agreed with. Steve Wozniak of Apple has set up home in Tasmania to avoid the worst effects of climate change. We decided on a rather more modest move to Scotland. The naturally cooler climate should mean that we'll be more comfortable in old age, and if the unthinkable happens and there's a multi-gigaton methane release due to melting permafrost, it might buy us a little more time. It felt like a betrayal of the autonomous house, which we didn't really want to leave. Nevertheless, we began a series of exploratory journeys. Scotland is roughly 2/3 the size of England, so a huge area to explore, but wanting to be somewhere significantly cooler, we'd narrowed our search to the area from Inverness northwards, so we went to explore Inverness and the surrounding areas first. Still not keen on embarking on another self-build project, we were looking for properties large enough for the two of us, plus Lizzie's elderly mother, and some additional space. We'd hoped to find somewhere ready to move into, which we could then maybe upgrade to a higher standard of energy efficiency, which would also be more comfortable. We didn't find anything on this first trip, and returned to Worcestershire with mixed feelings. But the idea of moving to Scotland just wouldn't go away, and a few weeks later, when we saw an advert for a house in the south of the Isle of Skye, we couldn't resist going to look at it. It was a very appealing modern house with fantastic views over the Sound of Slate. Relatively recently built and well insulated, it looked as though it might fit the bill. Sadly, it wasn't quite large enough, and with the autonomous house not even on the market, we didn't have the money to buy it anyway. But we did go and have a chat with rural design architects in Portree, having been rather taken by some of their houses, one of which featured in an episode of Channel 4's Grand Designs programme back in 2012. On the same trip, we discovered a building plot near the house we'd been to view, and the possibility of another self-build began to assume a greater reality. A few weeks later, we based ourselves in Ullapool, a town in a stunning location on the shores of Loch Broom. There we discovered architect Stuart Bagshaw's beautiful stone houses, but as they're holiday lets, you can't actually live in them. Our exploration to the north and east of Ullapool failed to uncover anything that really felt right, but the idea of moving to the Scottish Highlands, although triggered by the serious issue of climate change, was becoming more exciting. Around that time, Lizzie and I realised that we'd both been thinking the same thing, that there was something compelling about the idea of living on the Isle of Skye, and that if we didn't at least try it, we'd always regret it. An investigative adventure to Portree, the main town on Skye, soon followed. We had an intensive schedule of property viewing set up. We almost hit the jackpot with a house called Hillstone Lodge. Built on the shore of Loch Dunvegan, this purpose-built bed and breakfast could have been converted into a suitable home for the three of us. 4 ensuite bedrooms would have meant we had ready-made guest accommodation, although the communal areas would never have been quite right. Nevertheless, we were very tempted. That same afternoon, we'd arranged to look at a house on the edge of Portree itself. We both felt very much at home in the town, which is relatively compact but has good facilities. It's a very popular holiday destination, which means there are a number of excellent restaurants, and the town buzzes with tourists and other sightseers for much of the year. We already said that it would be the ideal place to live, but its popularity meant finding a suitable property could be close to impossible. We did quite like Orchard House, which we'd come to look at, but while we were looking round, we started discussing the property next door, which had only just come on the market. Not very interesting, perhaps, a perfectly pleasant but unremarkable 1960s bungalow. But wait a moment. Behind the bungalow, and part of the package, was land with planning permission, and to the west, a 9-acre croft, also part of the package, meaning it would be safe from development. It was almost a revelation. I clearly remember standing on the site looking at the estate agent's literature, realising we could build a south-facing house here, heated by the sun, with views of Portree Harbour and the distant Coolin Hills. The natural slope of the land would suit an upside-down layout with the main entrance on the upper floor. A lively burn running down the croft could power a small hydro generator. The bungalow was perfect temporary accommodation, right next to the building site, and all of this just 10 minutes walk from the centre of Portree. Lizzie and I realised this was an opportunity we absolutely couldn't miss, and that with that we had to accept that we would be building again. By now the autonomous house was on the market, but we didn't have a buyer, and without one the Portree property was out of reach. But by taking my pension early and emptying every savings account, we just managed to scrape the funds together, and our offer on the Portree bungalow, building site and croft was accepted. The alarming speed with which the Scottish legal system works meant we owned it less than 2 months later. And so, the Portree Passivhaus project came into being. We sold the autonomous house and moved to the bungalow in February 2017. We settled in quickly. We love the Isle of Skye, and we're hoping to begin building work on the new house early next year. The almost live webcam is now safely installed, so via portreepassivehouse.uk you'll be able to keep an eye on everything happening on the site. This, the first of the Portree Passivhaus video reports, has been very much about explaining the complex set of reasons behind our rather dramatic move from Worcestershire. The future reports will focus much more on the project we're now embarking on here, less than 2 years from the initial realisation that we would be moving. In report number 2, we'll be looking in detail at the design of our future home and explaining why, even if humanity's days are numbered, we still decided to build a passive house once again. We'll also take you on a brief but hopefully enjoyable tour of the Isle of Skye. There's no formal release schedule for these reports. They'll come out as and when we have news. So keep an eye on the website for future releases and for up-to-the-minute updates, the Portree Passivhaus Twitter feed. Do please join us next time.